are sitting here today, and I think it's actually prescient that I'm speaking after the panel on migration and the discussion on the recent travel ban, additional countries that have been added to that. And so in addition to the 6 countries that this administration has added to the list of those in the Muslim ban, you might have also seen that the administration has declared a public health emergency in the US and has also said that those who have spent, I think, 2 weeks or so in China are going to be banned from entering the country. So the travel ban also now extends to those who may have the risk of coronavirus. And so I wanted to invoke that in this space because I think the way that we conceive of public health risk and public health sort of crises is something that is especially racialized. And so at this very moment where the anxiety around the coronavirus is at its apex, we have a number of countries closing borders. We have a number of airlines who have stopped and canceled flights. A number of companies have ceased operations. In China, individuals that present as Asian are being racially profiled. We have kids being taunted and shamed in schools. And then increasing restrictions on the freedom of movement of Chinese people or people who present as Chinese. And there's the sense that the disease is tied to, at least I want to invoke the sense that the disease is tied to sort of longstanding historical narratives of, in this particular instance, quote unquote Orientals as diseased or dirty, and that is tied to a larger history and legacy of peoples that reside in the global South as being diseased and inferior. And so this mass hysteria surrounding the coronavirus, I think, in this moment has to be put in the context with sort of what the reality is, right? And so the reality is that this virus has a mortality rate of 2%, which is about a little bit more than the seasonal flu that kills globally 400,000 people. The seasonal flu has a mortality rate of a little less than 1%. And so I think that the coronavirus sort of vividly illustrates the ways in which diseases function, and diseases can be conflated and racialized, and can further politics of racial exclusion, politics of racial subordination. And so right now it's the coronavirus. Not that long ago it was Ebola. Not that long ago before then it was SARS. And not that long ago it was also Zika. And so the central claim in the piece that I make, or I'm making and developing as things are changing, is that global actors are responding to diseases in part based on the racial populations that are impacted by those diseases. And I should say, nothing makes one particular group that has been racialized as X more susceptible to Ebola or more susceptible to coronavirus or anything like that. But whatever the case, diseases come to be socially racialized, and that racialization process impacts how global actors are responding to diseases, and what the interventions are that are available at the level of the international system. And so the project is tying this, what I term the racial valuation of diseases, to a historical narrative that's rooted in and based on the ways in which race as a construct was created to other and differentiate peoples. And so the grouping of people into races was, as in the previous panel, drawing on the work of Cedric Robinson and the like, to differentiate, but to also to further the colonial and slavery and imperial project. And part of that project, I don't want to leave out, is also playing on tropes of scientific racism. So scientific racism then created actually sort of objective verification of this inferiority, right? So it's not just that there's a popular sense that these people are inferior, but we also have scientific theory or pseudoscientific theory to buttress this reality of inferiority. And so that is going to justify treating people of color, and particularly Black people, as something other than human. And in fact, we have theories that support, scientific theories, that, at least at the time, that support the idea that those of African descent are, a completely different, they're not human, they're completely different species. And so there is a way in which race and the racialization process and the creation of and putting and categorization of people into distinct racial groups has been also tied to sort of the ways in which disease has functioned. And so I in this piece am talking about the ways in which diseases have been racialized to further racial subordination. And to do that, I've been playing with this concept of racial valuation, and I use that concept to try to help explain what is happening, in this current moment, but also how we can think about the other responses to diseases in the global health space. And so just to articulate the concept of racial valuation very quickly, in the sociological literature, racial valuation is defined as the value placed on individuals or groups that's based on cognitive biases or stereotypes, and it relates directly to people's position in the racial hierarchy. And in the project, I am defining racial evaluation as the structural, hierarchical, and socially consequential valuation of racial groups. And so that racial valuation encompasses the perceived sum of the intrinsic value that particular groups have as a result of their race. And so that racial valuation of different groups is informed by the project of scientific racism, and it comes with legal and social results, drawing also on the work of course, Cheryl Harris and her work on whiteness and property, whiteness as property, there is a way in which the proximity to whiteness or the closeness to whiteness places you higher in the valuation system, and sort of the further away you are from whiteness, the less value is placed on one's life. And so that, as a historical matter, functioned transnationally and globally. And so racialized societies created structures, racial social structures within the societies, and then that project was replicated globally through the project of colonialism. And in the project, I argue that just because there is sort of this anti-colonial movement and decolonization did not disturb the underlying hierarchies that were existing globally, and it also created space for sort of a mutually constitutive relationship between the racialized structures that were created through racial valuation and individual society and laws. And so we see the promulgation of racial valuation norms up until today. And we see that in the space of global health and in the space of diseases, and the ways in which the historical conceptions of race and tying race to disease continue to emanate today, even though there is an attempt, I think, to distance oneself from sort of blatant scientific racism and other things like that. The argument that I'm making in the piece is that there are vestiges of that are remnant today, and that it informs public health interventions, it informs how we respond to disease burdens, it informs how diseases come to be naturalized or seen as inevitable, because those people have been diseased since however long, time immemorial. And so that framework then becomes illustrative and helpful for thinking about how material conditions in health are distributed, and how we might fashion societal responses differently, taking into account this racial evaluation of diseases. And so I just wanted to highlight two examples because I don't have too much time, but one is surrounding the recent Zika epidemic. And so in 2016, the New York City Department of Health conducted aerial spraying in Manhattan above 155th Street. So Zika, for those of you who don't know, is spread primarily through mosquitoes, and so this aerial spraying above 155th Street, if you're not familiar with New York, that coincided with Washington Heights and the Inwood neighborhoods in New York, and those neighborhoods tend to be predominantly Latinx. And so it presented the illusion that spraying Latinx people is somehow going to contain the Zika virus, right? Not that you need to contain the mosquitoes, but it's the people themselves, right? And also too, as if the mosquitoes are only congregating in the neighborhoods of Washington Heights and Inwood, right? They're not going below that racial line. But so, I mean, it's ridiculous, but it's also sad, right? It's drawing on long-standing historical practices that have quarantined and subjected people of color to different sets of public health interventions because of the ways in which diseases become racialized and become associated with particular groups. And so that's one instance that I talk about in the piece. The other instance that I would highlight too as an example of this is the Ebola epidemic in 2016, although the most recent one conjures that up as well. But the 2014-2015 West African Ebola epidemic really set off sort of fears of racial contagion in the US. Children of African immigrants in Dallas were taunted as Ebola kids. 2 students from Rwanda were sent home from a New Jersey elementary school. For those of you who didn't major in geography, Rwanda is on the complete opposite side of the continent of Africa. Texas College sent out letters denying admission to some students from Nigeria, even though the World Health Organization had proclaimed Nigeria Ebola-free at that time. And there are a host of other cases where you see Ebola being racialized as Black, as emanating from this dark continent, reviving historical images of these quote-unquote savage bodies, these unruly bodies, these bodies that cannot be contained, and these bodies that we need to protect ourselves from. And we see that playing out, I think, in large part with what's happening right now with the coronavirus, right? There's a sense that we need to contain the threat from China. This threat is not one that's just political and economic. It's also one that's embodied in the very bodies of people who are Chinese. And so we need to put restrictions on them and their movement and their freedom in order to contain this threat. And so there's a way in which racialized fears really can galvanize public action and public movement in the space of global health. Within, I think yesterday, the World Health Organization declared a public health emergency of international concern. Like I said, the US has already said that this is a public health emergency within this country, even though, like I said at the outset, the seasonal flu kills more people globally, kills more people within the US than the coronavirus. And so I think it's important to interrogate race and the role that race is playing and the valuation attached to particular groups that are seen as barriers or carriers of disease, and how that's informing transnational and global responses. And so one of the things I'm hoping to do in this project is to develop, what are the theoretical and legal implications of this, and how do we, is there a way to change sort of the politics of fear, or the politics of fear of racial contagion in terms of determining global public response to diseases, right? Because there's a way in which, in some sense, you might think that, well, this is good, it draws attention and the like, but in another sense, it also instrumentalizes the livelihood of people of color, right? Because now we only care about a disease if it's going to implicate people in the global north, right? So if white people are somehow implicated by disease, then that's gonna raise its valuation publicly in the global health regime, and so that means that we need more resources to dedicate to that. And so the problem with that is that it tends to focus on disease-specific interventions internationally that are focused around crises, and so we need to frame diseases as security threats if we want to get money. But if the disease is not phrased as security threat, it could still be very harmful, right? Millions of people could still be dying of the thing, but because we don't conceive of it as a threat, because it's not racialized, maybe that's not gonna draw enough public funding, resources, and space for intervention. And then that also undermines building actually robust public health systems to try to actually deal with threats. And then there is this emergensification, securitization that is happening in the space that we also see happening in other spaces that we've talked about, and migration is one of them as well, which goes against, I think, or undermines sort of larger public health objectives. And so there are a number of problems with the way in which race is functioning, and so this project is trying to draw attention to the influence of race in global health, which I think is this place where race has been rendered semi-invisible. And so the work of this project is to render that visible, but I also think the framework in the piece has a use for other areas of law and policy, and thinking through the ways in which this project and all of our work can help to further anti-subordination. And my time is up, so thank you.
So I too would like to add my voice, well, first, congratulations. Add my voice of thanks to the Law Review team for organizing this fabulous event, and Asla Tendai for your leadership and guidance through this. It's a delight to be back and to be able to continue this conversation. And I'm continuing it with a paper that emerges actually out of a course. And that course was the Transnational Futures of International Labor Law that I taught last year with guest speakers from around the world to celebrate or commemorate and think critically about the International Labor Organization on its centenary. And so my co-author is a student from that course, Alice Duquesnoy, who is in France now and unfortunately couldn't be with us. But this emerges out of engagements with the early history of the ILO and the way in which its own self-concept of labor and slavery as connected, how that self-concept has been sidelined, forgotten, even as the history of the institution is being retold. And so part of the work I've been doing in a broader project is around the archives of the ILO, of the League of Nations, looking into the ways in which slavery was conceptualized, who the actors were who entered into the various commissions to establish the first slavery convention, including Dantes Bellegarde, who had a slightly different vision coming from Haiti than many of the colonial administrators who ultimately found themselves on the second commission that essentially erased race from the definition in the Slavery Convention. The ILO, the early institution around this, actually tried to claim back the responsibility to engage with slavery, arguing that it was part of its own trajectory of addressing labor standards, of addressing labor issues. But that was not heard as a framing, and really the narrative that the ILO had propelled up until that point was our institution emerges out of an understanding of the Industrial Revolution as the starting point. So erasing that very present understanding of slavery as central to the emergence of capitalism. So Eric Williams, and then the abundance of literature flowing through now that frames our understanding that way. The ILO did not claim that vision at that time and came to this belatedly, and then when it stepped in to reclaim what was left, the work on forced labor as part of the native labor mandate, rather than follow W.E.B. Du Bois's plea to interrogate the conditions of the non-white, if you will, the black world, racialized world, colonized world, of course, the focus became a further othering of the whole category of the native labor problem. Some of the archives actually still say, though, colored labor, and you see it in the framing around a concern that was actually more expansive, more capacious than the mandate to deal with colonized subjects would allow. So they were looking, despite their mandate, at China, at, of course, Ethiopia, and the framing there enabled incursions that would otherwise have fallen beyond. So a longer story, and part of telling that story through labor and through an institution that has all but fallen off the map in terms of international labor law, the ILO, is to reclaim an understanding of the rootedness of slavery, of indigeneity in international law through the framings that were actively constructed to maintain a colonial division of labor, just at the same time as one was extending a protective, increasingly welfare statist vision of labor in the global north. So the specific slice of this project that the paper represents is an engagement with the way in which our framing of slavery focuses on forgetting the past. So we've inherited a way of speaking about slavery that, of course, accentuates property and ownership, but that loses connection to centuries-long legalized processes of racialization that the literature on racial capitalism centers. We lose the Black Atlantic, and much has been said already today about, of course, Cedric Robinson's vision that takes us through a framing of racialization that challenges classic Marxist visions of the disjuncture between feudalism and the emergence of capitalism, that dislodges the easy assumption that has prevailed between liberal democracy and capitalism, and situates us firmly within the terrain of divided terrain, as Stuart Hall would say, as the way in which capitalism advances. But the focus on so-called modern slavery or contemporary forms of slavery allows us to think about the work that's operated when slavery itself loses its history. The afterlife of slavery, the Black Atlantic, is no longer part of the conversation. It literally falls off the map. And as I was surveying the archival materials, as the new 1926 Slavery Convention was being implemented, countries were polled. And so countries like my own, Canada, said things like, we never had slavery, and slavery's not on the books. Others simply had to answer, we have laws against slavery, and that disappeared. right? But slavery became the terrain through which we constructed the illiberal other, right? So detailed ethnographic, anthropological studies of Ethiopia were the order of the day. And they framed how we could at once retain active colonialism and retain the moral authority to claim to investigate the slavery existing elsewhere. Right? I would suggest that that same enactment continues to operate now in the discourse of modern slavery, to the extent that it erases the legacies of transatlantic slavery. It turns its eyes resolutely away from mass incarceration, and its gaze instead is on women and children. Its gaze is on, to the extent that it looks at chains, value chains, in transnational movements of capital, it places attention on that narrowest of borders, that is, the most egregious forms of exploitation in enterprises, and leaves the broader displacement of persons, management within context where the post-colonial state has largely had to step out to leave the governance to the multinational enterprises whose GDP is often larger than the states in which they operate. Most of that is lost. So the positive labor vision is lost. My paper is a fairly doctrinal one, despite my presentation of it here. It takes you through a fairly close analysis of how the ILO's specialized supervisory mechanism that has been in place since 1926 looks at the application of the narrower forced labor conventions, including one that the US actually ratified, the Forced Labor Convention number 105. That convention speaks specifically to racialization, and for reasons that I still can't figure out, the US considered when it ratified in the 1990s that wouldn't really affect it. It has avoided the convention from the ILO on forced labor that turns its attention or its lens back onto public and private prisons and the use of forced labor in those contexts because of the 13th Amendment interpretation that that does permit slavery in prisons, or slave labor in prisons. But Convention 105 was ratified, and the supervisory body has turned its attention to mass incarceration and the racialization of this. And it's done it in its habitual, gentle, incremental, but unmistakable way. And the response has been to introduce an alternative frame. So rather than meeting the concerns around disproportionate, grossly disproportionate representation of African Americans in prisons, the US response has been to turn to trafficking, to its trafficking legislation, to its work to act in its police capacity to basically redress this harm, women and children. Again, so that kind of focus and outward looking, what we are doing in the world. Whereas the Committee of Experts hasn't disregarded that. It has acknowledged that as part of the panoply of considerations that fall under the forced labor instruments, but has kept attention on mass incarceration and the need to redress this. And so I raise this as one of those singular examples where you've actually got relatively robust interrogation of state action in relation to a legacy of slavery that is all but forgotten in the framing of what international labor law is about. In much of my time is up, but I'll just mention much of the literature around, in particular, African American struggle for recognition of a broader panoply of human rights in the international context has focused on the post-Second World War period and has emphasized the UN Charter and the ensuing instruments. Attention to that earlier period and that earlier moment of internationalization and engagement and contestation about the kind of vision we should have for framing involvement flows through this kind of discussion and this kind of normative framework that is operating still. When Carol Anderson makes the claim that Eyes on the Prize would have entailed a vision that is equality-seeking and human rights-seeking, I think some of the earlier contestation actually suggests that the prize was deeper still, and it was a firm understanding of what it would take to decolonize and to rethink what it meant to repair slavery. Thanks.
Well, thank you, and I'm very aware that I'm the very last person speaking, so I won't pontificate for too long, but thanks so much to the Law Review editors and Tendai and Esla for including me on this program and allowing me to comment on these two amazing papers. So, you know, they're two pretty distinct projects in that one is about labor and one is about health, but I would say that the common thread among them is really thinking about how racial ideologies travel and morph as they make their way through international institutions, as they land in national context, as Vasuki said, as they take their own form and shape as they, in those national contexts. You know, they're also both projects that are critiques of the left and progressive communities of the world, I would say. You have on one hand, well, the ILO not so much necessarily with its tripartite structure, but you know, the idea that, you know, something about the anti-trafficking discourse, something about labor rights, in Matiangai's story, something about global health advocates who all think they're doing a really good thing, and yet the discourse of the fields itself, both in labor and health, are basically implicated in maintaining racial orders. So something you said in your paper, Adelle, that I thought was so interesting was that racial disparities, the language of racial disparities actually mutes our ability to talk about racism. And again, you know, the idea of trafficking, the idea of modern day slavery itself is a distraction from some of the larger stories that need to be told and in which our current work needs to be situated in. And Matiangai, how racial valuation is buried in the logics of global public health and in the response to epidemics. So I took the idea that I should respond to them very specifically, pretty seriously. So I have a couple really specific comments and questions that came to me as I was reading the papers, and I hope that they're helpful to you. Matiangai, Matiangai and I often end up in health law spaces together, and I should just say that she's really doing a lot of hard work as a junior person, especially, well, now senior, but to make sure that everyone remembers that we need to be talking about race in the context of health and disease in particular. There's a lot of conversation in the health law world about racial disparities. Again, coming back to your invocation about how racial disparities actually mask some of the language of racism, but just to put on the table that a lot of this work is really new and really innovative, and I appreciate what you're doing. One of the things I thought when I was reading your article, maybe as someone who feels protective of you, is that I wondered what the critique would be from a sort of more conservative or more mainstream law and economics perspective. And I think I partly was thinking about this because I just finished reading Richard Posner and Thomas Phillipson's book, Private Choices in Public Health, The AIDS Epidemic and Economic Perspective, which I highly recommend if you want to be annoyed for a few days. And, basically, I wonder, what the economic rationales are that have fallen out of your analysis, and, what they are hanging around in the background that have actually been coded in the language we use in global public health. So burdens of disease, quality-adjusted life years, disability-adjusted life years, which are all basically indicators of, people's ability to work and their contribution to GDP. What is the role of race? In their analysis in Private Choices in Public Health, they're really interested in why people make the decisions they make to have risky sex. And for them, risky sex is essentially the outcome of a utility calculation where we subtract the costs of risky sex from the benefits of risky sex, and then act on that accordingly. Now, while they're focused on these acts of risky sex, what they're actually also interested in is how the government should be regulating the epidemic and these specific individual private acts. And they conclude in their book that nearly every public intervention in the context of AIDS, whether it's voluntary HIV testing or sex education, the government should not intervene except in the criminalization of HIV. And race, in the transmission of HIV, and race becomes really important to their analysis. They have this idea that, because the markets of black men and women are small, and the actual ratios are relative to one another, this drives people's utility calculations and decreases the ability of black women, for example, to bargain for condom use in sex, and explains in their minds the higher rates of HIV in the black community. Now, a lot of this kind of logic gets coded. In their papers, they thank the World Bank. They're workshopping their papers at the World Bank. It becomes part of the global public health response. The structural adjustment programs that we see, the individual responsibility narratives that rise, the imprint left by cost effectiveness analysis, again, like in calculating global disease burdens, disability adjusted life years. I'm just wondering how your story fits into that story, like how you're in conversation with that conversation, which is also in some ways about race. They make it explicitly about race, and they've been very successful. That law and economics perspective has been very successful in really becoming the main way in which we should think about the global health response. So I also was interested in this idea of law as, we've talked about law as a technology, of race as a technology, all day today. And, in the paper, there's so much stuff going on with law. So law is a technology of development. Law is a technology, you could say law is a technology of war. Law is a technology of disease control. And in each of these modes, the law seems to act differently. So how, when someone is constructed as a national security threat, for example, do the rules of global health interventions change? So here, the example I'm a little bit obsessed with is the idea of polio in Pakistan, which, is really a story about how the sort of war on terror undermined the entire public health infrastructure in Pakistan, allowing and on the Pakistan-Afghanistan border especially, allowing polio to sort of spread. It's all wrapped up in trying to catch Osama bin Laden and this kind of, and I really think, I wonder how you might be thinking about this in relation to the broader TWAIL literature. How do we think about international legal orders as producing the structural inequalities in these different modes that they're in, development, war? How does empire and imperialism shift our notions of sickness, who deserves healthcare and who doesn't, and how that is sort of a constantly moving line. You have a lot in your paper about racial science, and racial science has come up a few times today, and I think there's a few ideas that's in the literature on the sociology of medicine and race, which is interesting and hasn't really come up in the course of our conversation today, which is that, in some ways, Black bodies especially have always been treated as sort of different, but in many ways, and this comes up, Deidre Cooper Owen shows this in her book on Black women in gynecology, for example. The fact that we were testing all of the new gynecological procedures on Black women's bodies, people didn't have the choice to participate necessarily. She complicates that history quite a lot, but there's a certain way that there's a sameness assumption too, right? I mean, we're not going to extrapolate and generalize from a set of bodies that we actually think are truly different. So it's like this, rhetorically, we're all different, but actually when it comes to the practice of medicine and testing and clinical trials today, we're all the same. And both Alondra Nelson and Steve Epstein, and Alondra Nelson in her book Body and Soul about the Black Panthers, also discuss the way that social movement actors have actually mobilized ideas of racial difference to bring about distributional shifts. So, for example, the Black Panthers specifically used sickle cell. Ruha Benjamin talks about this as well. Like this idea of advocating around sickle cell as a way to say we have a common blood project here. It's not just about identity. It's about and this racial, and just in a totally different context, not so much in the social movements context, but in the context of the HPV vaccine rollout in India, the Indian government said also that one of the reasons why we need to think about the way the HPV vaccine is being rolled out and the populations that the HPV vaccine is being tested on is because racial groups are essentially distinct. So there's all these different ways in which in our contemporary mode, these ideas of racial difference are basically brought up for good, for bad, but essentially to deal with some of the distributional implications of the broader global health project. As someone who writes on social movements, I was curious from your perspective who you think is doing the resistance in the space of epidemics today. And how do we? Who are those people? Who were the people when Haitians were detained in Guantanamo in 1992? Who were resisting that? There were also a lot of those people were in the global public health, are in that sort of global public health space. And what does that mean to you that they were there? Because there's a way that when you read your paper, you forget that there might have been another side or there might have been contestation. And I'm just curious from your perspective. Maybe it's not good enough from your perspective, or maybe it's so small that it's not, but I just wanted to hear more. And then, Adelle, your knowledge and work on the ILO and labor is so beyond my scope. I hope I can say something helpful. But I did have so many questions when I read your paper, and I didn't know if maybe that would help shape, where people might be picking up on, little points. I didn't have a clear sense of why the 1930 convention that you mentioned excluded labor as a condition of, excluded from the definition of forced labor, labor that was a condition of conviction. And I really wanted the specific story around that. So who were the key government players? You mentioned someone when you were speaking now that, what were, and I was thinking about Devon's work here, but when the actors were sent off to the ILO, how are their identities constructed? How are their identities constrained? I was also thinking about Tim Lovelace's work on looking at how, the connection between the civil rights and the civil rights actors who were essentially going to human rights institutions, and how they were bringing their own racial projects to the human rights institutions, and there were, how they were basically constrained and hamstrung by the State Department's objectives, and at the same time had their own ideas about how to bring racial shifts. I was so taken by your idea about what your arguments were around the trafficking discourse and how it's basically undermining our ability to, and this is less about your presentation, more about what you have in your paper, but how it was really undermining our ability to see prison labor and specifically as, you know, and I couldn't get a sense for whether you wanted prison labor to be treated as slavery or if you were contesting the idea of slavery, but I thought the idea that somehow trafficking was eliding our ability to understand, I mean, that it was such an effective tool, essentially, in not allowing us to understand what was going on in the prison labor context. Of course, I thought about all the feminist work on sex trafficking and the way, you know, how there's been so much feminist complicity in the justification for the rise of a criminalization approach, how it's a distraction from larger structural goals. I thought that it might provide you some useful language for how the trafficking discourse does this work of eliding and hiding, and even in the sex trafficking context, making this prison situation worse because so many more people are in prison because of this sex trafficking, the push to end sex trafficking. And, you know, in that sense, you know, the way you do have these new technologies of governance, how trafficking itself has become this neo-imperial project with the US government, as you said, at the heart of it, the indicators, the threats to humanitarian assistance, the carceral law reform projects that are all built into the rule of law project. And I was curious, you know, if I were to transplant some of that into your project, how that would play out, you know, how would we imagine prison labor in that context? And of course, this is all racialized, you know, this is very clearly developed in the literature on sex trafficking, where there's, you know, very clear ideas of who the victims are and who the juvenile delinquents are, and that's of course plays out exactly as you'd expect, with sort of young white women being seen as the ideal victims, and certainly in the context of compulsory labor in prisons, it's very hard to imagine the ability to kind of reconstruct that person as a victim of a broader system of sort of injustices in labor. I also was wondering about your transnational approach, because there's, you know, I was wondering how each specific person in prison as a laborer is being made, essentially. I'm thinking about Ian Hacking's work, you know, making up people. You know, how is each person made by the international institutions, by the domestic institutions? You know, how are you seeing that actually working? Because as you mentioned in your paper, the US government is quite resistant to the ILO. I mean, we have a very conservative legal regime when it comes to labor in general. You know, how do you see some of these ideas about labor actually traveling? You know, what circuits do they travel from the ILO into the United States? Why the ILO, you know? Why not US labor law? And so I would just love to hear more about that. And finally, corporations are almost entirely absent from your paper, or employers are almost entirely absent, and it's really hard. You mentioned global value chains in your presentation. It seems really difficult to talk about prison labor without thinking about global value chains and the role of the corporation in particular. Yes. So I'm just, anyways, I just love to hear more.
Thank you.
Yeah.